Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Lillian Vance laughed as she poured the vintage champagne over Elena Vance's hand-sketched blueprints in front of the city's elite. The pale gold liquid soaked into the vellum, blurring the intricate ink lines of the botanical gardens that had been Elena's life's work for the last 6 months. A few socialites gasped, but most simply tilted their heads, watching with the detached curiosity of people observing a car crash. "Oh, darling, look at that," her mother said, her voice a practiced trill of mock sympathy that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "I've saved you from yourself. You've always been so prone to overexertion, and after your little episode, we simply can't have you stressing over nursery orders and soil pH." Elena stood perfectly still. The scent of expensive lilies and heavy, floral perfume from the gala's massive centerpieces felt like a physical weight in the humid ballroom. She felt the dampness of the wine seeping through the blueprints and onto her fingers, but she didn't flinch. Beneath the silk of her high-necked gown, the jagged scar over her heart, the permanent souvenir of the surgery she'd faced entirely alone, seemed to throb in time with the rhythmic bass of the string quartet. "That was the final draft for the Heritage Park project," Elena said, her voice low and steady. It was a stark contrast to the frantic, high-pitched energy radiating from her mother. "It's Julian's project now," Lillian replied, waving a manicured hand toward the far end of the room. There stood Julian Vance, the golden child, currently laughing at a joke made by a city councilman. He looked every bit the rising political star, his suit tailored to hide the softness of a man who had never performed a day of hard labor in his life. "He needs the win, Elena. His campaign needs the visibility of a public works project, and frankly, you look like you're about to collapse. Dr. Marcus Thorne might have cleared you for light activity, but the Vance family cannot afford a public health crisis in the middle of a gala." The injustice of it tasted like copper in Elena's mouth. While she had been lying in a sterile ICU bed, clutching a pillow to her chest just to breathe, her mother had been busy redirecting her contracts. Lillian hadn't visited once, claiming the vibe of a cardiac ward was detrimental to her skin. "You're giving my design to a man who can't tell a willow from a weed?" Elena asked. "I'm giving the credit to the person who can actually use it," Lillian snapped, the mask of the doting mother slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the shark beneath. She leaned in closer, the smell of gin and expensive mints cloying. "Be realistic, Elena. You're a liability. You're the daughter who broke. Julian is the future. Now go find Sarah Jenkins and tell her you're consulting from home for the foreseeable future. If you make a scene, I'll ensure the medical bills I've been paying suddenly become your sole responsibility." Lillian turned on her heel, her sequins catching the light of the crystal chandeliers like scales, and glided toward a group of donors. She didn't look back. She never did. She moved through the world assuming everyone was a footstool or a stepping stone. Elena looked down at the ruined blueprints. The ink was a gray smudge now, a literal wash of her efforts down the drain. She felt the familiar sting in her chest, the phantom pain that Marcus Thorne warned her was often more psychological than physical. She took a slow, measured breath, the way the nurses had taught her. She wasn't the same woman who had collapsed in the dirt 6 months ago. Her hand moved to the small, beaded clutch at her waist. Inside wasn't just lipstick and a mirror. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, cold brass key and a folded piece of heavy cardstock, the private land deed to the northern acreage of the heritage site. Lillian and Julian assumed the land was part of the Vance estate. They assumed it was theirs to gift to the city in exchange for political favors. They had forgotten that the land had been a direct inheritance from Elena's grandmother, bypassed through the male line because the old woman had seen exactly what Julian was. Elena looked across the room. Julian was now pointing at a digital rendering of the park, her park, claiming the vision for the Vance Memorial Grove as his own. The donors were nodding, impressed by his supposed civic-mindedness. "You shouldn't be standing," a voice said softly beside her. Elena didn't turn. She knew the cadence of Dr. Marcus Thorne's voice without looking. "I'm not standing, Marcus, I'm hovering." "Your heart rate is elevated," he noted, glancing at the subtle monitor on his own phone that synced with the device under her skin. "Lillian is doing her best to kill you, Elena. Why do you let her?" "She thinks she's already succeeded," Elena said, her eyes fixed on her mother's triumphant silhouette. "She thinks I'm a ghost haunting my own life." She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a few quick taps, she sent a single, encrypted file to the city's lead auditor. It was the environmental impact report she'd sat on for weeks, the one that proved the specific plot Julian was currently promising to the city was protected wetlands, untouchable for the kind of high-density development Julian's donors were secretly planning. Julian was about to build his entire political career on a foundation of sinking mud. "I'm going home," Elena said, her voice gaining a new, cold edge. "Good," Marcus replied. "Rest is mandatory." "Oh, I'm not going to rest," Elena whispered, watching as her mother threw her head back in a fake, glittering laugh. "I'm going to watch the countdown." She turned and walked toward the exit, her pace deliberate and strong. She didn't look at the blueprints on the floor. She didn't need them. The entire map of the Vance family's destruction was already etched perfectly in her mind. The groundbreaking ceremony was in exactly 3 days. By then, the champagne would be long gone, and the only thing pouring would be the consequences of a mother who had finally pushed the wrong child too far. The next morning, the sterile scent of lilies filled Elena's design studio, but they weren't a gesture of recovery. They were a prop. Elena Vance sat at her drafting table, the rhythmic hum of the large-scale plotter the only thing keeping her grounded. Her chest felt heavy, a lingering ache from the hospital bed she'd fled just hours ago, but she refused to slow down. She reached up, her fingers brushing the hard plastic edge of the heart monitor taped beneath her charcoal sweater. It was a silent witness to the life her family had nearly extinguished for the sake of a photo op. The door to the studio clicked open, and Lillian Vance swept in, trailing the suffocating scent of jasmine and unearned authority. She didn't ask how Elena's heart was. She didn't look at the pale, translucent cast of her daughter's skin. Instead, she dropped a heavy, cream-colored garment bag onto the pristine blueprints spread across the table. "The black dress you wore last night was a disaster," Lillian said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth as she adjusted a diamond-encrusted brooch on her lapel. "You looked like a ghost, and the press noticed. I've sent for this silk piece for the groundbreaking ceremony. It's in exactly 72 hours, Elena. Try to find some color in your cheeks by then. Julian's campaign cannot afford a sister who looks like she's 1 foot in the grave while he's trying to project a vision of the future." Elena didn't pull the garment bag away. She didn't even look at it. "I was in the ICU, Mother. Dr. Marcus Thorne said my heart nearly stopped." "You were overstimulated," Lillian corrected, smoothing her perfectly coiffed hair in the reflection of a framed architectural award on the wall. "Julian says you're being difficult about the final structural sign-off for the plaza. He's coming up now to collect it. Do be a dear and don't make a scene." "He's already stressed about the polling in the 4th district. We all have roles to play, Elena. Yours is to be the supportive architect, not a professional victim." The rage was a cold, steady thing now, replacing the frantic fluttering in her chest. Lillian exited as quickly as she'd arrived, leaving behind a lingering cloud of perfume and the unspoken command to disappear into the background of her own life. Minutes later, the heavy thud of Julian Vance's designer loafers echoed in the hallway. He entered without knocking, radiating the practiced charisma of a man who had never been told no. He looked at his sister, his eyes scanning her not for health, but for compliance. "The waiver, Elle," he said, tapping a gold fountain pen against his palm. "The foreman says you're flagging the northeast quadrant again. It's a waste of time and money. The foundations are fine." "The soil is liquefying, Julian," she said, her voice low and dangerously calm. "If you pour the concrete now, the entire plaza will settle unevenly within 5 years. It's a death trap." Julian leaned over her desk, his shadow blotting out her work. He smelled of expensive bourbon and arrogance. "It's a legacy. And in 3 days, when the cameras are rolling and I'm holding that silver shovel, you're going to be standing behind me, smiling. Sign the papers. I've already told the board the environmental concerns were a clerical error on your part. You've been unwell. They'll understand why you missed the details." He shoved a folder toward her. Elena felt the weight of it, the sheer audacity of him asking her to risk her professional license to cover his greed. She looked at the gold pen, then at her brother's smug, expectant face. "A clerical error," she repeated. "Exactly. You're tired. Everyone knows you've been struggling," Julian smirked, already turning toward the door as if her signature were a foregone conclusion. 72 hours, Elena. Don't be late for the fitting. The cream silk is non-negotiable." As the door clicked shut, Elena didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she pulled a sleek, unmarked laptop from a locked drawer beneath her desk. She logged into a private server, the blue light reflecting in her steady, narrowed eyes. She didn't just have the survey. She pulled up a digital deed, one Julian had never bothered to check. Months ago, under the guise of an anonymous trust, Elena had purchased the narrow, gravel strip of land that served as the only heavy machinery access point to the Vance Plaza site. Julian had assumed it was a public easement. It wasn't. It was hers. She touched the screen, a ghost of a smile finally touching her lips. He thought he was building a monument to his greatness. He didn't realize he was building it on a stage she could dismantle with a single phone call. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd kept in her private contacts. "Marcus," she said when the doctor answered. "I need that medical report finalized, the one documenting the stress-induced cardiac event caused by the gala incident, and call my lawyer. Tell him we're ready to execute the easement blockade on Thursday morning." She hung up and looked at the countdown clock on her computer. 2 days, 23 hours. The Vance family was about to learn that the cost of breathing wasn't something they could bill to her anymore. The groundbreaking wasn't just a ceremony. It was a trap, and Julian had just handed her the keys to the cage. The following morning, the sterile scent of eucalyptus and industrial disinfectant hung heavy in the private wing of the clinic. Elena Vance sat on the edge of the examination table, the crinkle of the sanitary paper beneath her sounding like dry autumn leaves. She stared at the rhythmic, grayscale pulse of her own heart on the monitor, a fragile, fluttering thing that had nearly given up under the weight of her family's expectations. Dr. Marcus Thorne stepped into the room, his expression a mask of professional concern as he clicked his pen against a heavy manila folder. The sound was sharp, echoing off the tiled walls. He didn't look at the screen, he looked at her. "The results are conclusive," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "The cardiac event at the gala wasn't a fluke. It was a direct result of acute, sustained psychological stress. Your body literally tried to shut down to escape the environment." He handed her the folder. The weight of it felt substantial, a physical manifestation of the pain she'd buried for years. "This report is comprehensive. It documents the timeline, the triggers, and the long-term damage." "It's the weapon you asked for, Elena." She ran her thumb over the embossed seal of the clinic. "Thank you, Marcus. I need it for the easement blockade. My lawyer is filing the injunction as we speak." "Just be careful," he warned. "Your heart can't take another confrontation like the last one." "I won't be the one under pressure this time," she replied, her voice as cold as the stethoscope he'd used minutes before. The heavy brass handle of the door turned abruptly, and the air in the room shifted. Lillian Vance swept in, her presence announced by the cloying, suffocating scent of expensive gardenia perfume. She was dressed in a crisp, cream-colored suit that cost more than the medical equipment in the room, her hair perfectly coiffed as if she were heading to a press conference rather than a hospital. "There you are," Lillian said, her eyes scanning the room with a look of profound distaste. She didn't ask how Elena felt. She didn't even acknowledge the doctor. "Julian is pacing the foyer like a caged animal. We've been looking for you for an hour. Why aren't you answering your phone?" "I was having an ultrasound, Mother," Elena said, her voice devoid of emotion. Lillian waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. You've always had a flair for the theatrical when things don't go your way. That little dizzy spell at the gala was embarrassing enough. You can't hide in a clinic forever while the family is on the verge of its greatest achievement. The audacity of the statement hit Elena like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She simply gripped the medical file tighter. "Julian needs you to sign the final construction waiver for the Vance Plaza," Lillian continued, stepping closer until the scent of her perfume was overwhelming. He realized there was a clerical oversight regarding the eastern boundary. It's a formality, really. Just a signature to confirm the easement is public. "It's not public," Elena said quietly. "Excuse me." "The land," Elena repeated, looking her mother in the eye. "It belongs to me. It was part of the trust Dad set up before he died. Julian didn't do his due diligence." Lillian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. Julian is a Vance. He doesn't make mistakes like that. Now get dressed. He's coming up here himself to settle this." Minutes later, the door swung open again and Julian Vance marched in. He looked every bit the rising political star, his suit tailored to project power, but his eyes were bloodshot and his movements were frantic. He didn't see a sister in a hospital gown. He saw an obstacle. "Elena, enough of this," Julian snapped, pulling a folded document from his breast pocket. "The groundbreaking is in 48 hours. The governor is confirmed. The press is booked. I don't have time for your petty grievances or this performance." He gestured vaguely at the heart monitor. "Sign the waiver, now." "I'm not signing anything, Julian," she said. He stepped into her personal space, his shadow falling over her. "Listen to me. That project is my legacy. It's the Vance legacy. You're sitting here playing the victim while I'm building a monument to our family name. Do you have any idea what happens if that project stalls? The investors will pull out. My career will be over before it starts." "Then I suppose you should have checked the deed," she replied, her pulse steady for the first time in years. Julian's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "You're going to ruin everything over a strip of dirt. You've always been the weak link, Elena. Dad knew it and Mother knows it. You're just like him, frail, indecisive, and ultimately useless." The room went silent. Dr. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his face darkening. "Mr. Vance, I must ask you to leave. My patient is recovering from a serious—" "Stay out of this, doctor," Julian hissed, turning back to Elena. "You think you're powerful because you're holding a grudge? You're nothing. Without the Vance name, you're a gardener with a bad heart. Sign the paper, or I will make sure the trust is contested. I'll leave you with nothing." Elena stood up slowly, the medical gown fluttering around her legs. She looked small, but as she held the manila folder against her chest, the power dynamic in the room shifted. She saw the desperation behind Julian's arrogance. He wasn't a visionary, he was a thief who had been caught. "The groundbreaking is on Thursday, isn't it?" Elena asked, her voice a calm whisper that cut through his rage. 10 a.m. sharp, Julian sneered. "Good," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I'll see you there. But you might want to tell your contractors to keep their engines running. They won't be staying long." She walked past him, the cold tile beneath her feet grounding her. She felt the weight of the evidence in her hand and the countdown clock in her head. 47 hours. Julian had spent his life building a cage for her, but he'd forgotten one thing. He'd built it on her foundation. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at her mother and brother, who stood frozen in their entitled fury. "Oh, and Julian," she added, "make sure you wear your best suit for the cameras. You'll want to look good when the fences go up." She stepped out into the hallway, leaving the scent of gardenias and the sound of Julian's rising shout behind her. She had the medical report, she had the deed, and for the first time in her life, she had the breath to finish what they started. The following afternoon, the sun hung low over the Vance family estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sprawling lawn where Julian Vance had already begun marking his territory. Elena Vance stood on the stone veranda, watching the yellow excavators rumble onto the grass she had spent years meticulously nurturing. The sharp, metallic scent of diesel hung heavy in the air, clashing with the delicate fragrance of the late-blooming roses. "Move those stakes further toward the north wing," Julian shouted, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had never been told no. He turned as Sarah Jenkins approached him with a stack of blueprints, his face splitting into a wide, performative grin. He didn't notice his sister standing above him, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Elena felt the weight of the heavy, cream-colored envelope in her jacket pocket. The deed that proved the ground he was standing on didn't belong to him. Her pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against her ribs. She descended the stairs, the crunch of Julian's handmade Italian loafers on the loose gravel sounding like breaking bone as he paced the perimeter. "Ah, Elena," he said, barely glancing her way as she approached the group. "I was wondering when you'd come down to see the progress." "Sarah and I were just discussing the foyer expansion. It's going to be magnificent, a real statement for the campaign." Sarah offered a tight, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's an ambitious design, Julian." "It's a fantasy," Julian corrected, chuckling as he slapped a hand on the shoulder of the lead contractor. "But that's what we do, isn't it? We build the dream. Elena, why don't you go find Lillian? She's inside worrying about the catering for tomorrow's groundbreaking. Maybe you can help her pick out the flower colors, something pretty but inexpensive." The contractor let out a low, awkward cough, and Sarah suddenly found something very interesting to look at on her clipboard. It was a calculated strike, a public reminder that in Julian's world, Elena was nothing more than a glorified gardener. "The soil here is deceptive," Elena said, her voice cool and level, cutting through his laughter. She stepped onto the grass, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "If you dig too deep without checking the underlying structure, everything tends to collapse. You should be careful where you tell them to dig, Julian. You might find the foundation isn't as solid as you think." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing. "I've had the surveys done, Elena. I know exactly what I'm standing on." "Do you?" she asked, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She reached into her pocket, her fingertips brushing the embossed seal on the document. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're building on borrowed time." "Enough with the riddles," he snapped, his face reddening as he realized the workmen were listening. "You've always been jealous of the legacy. Just because you don't have the vision to see what this family can become doesn't mean you get to stall my progress. Go inside." Lillian Vance appeared in the doorway then, her silhouette framed by the grand arched entrance. She looked down at them, her expression one of pinched disapproval. "Julian is right, Elena. Stop making a scene in front of the staff. Your brother is trying to save what's left of our reputation. The least you could do is stay out of the way." The betrayal was familiar, a dull ache Elena had learned to live with, but today it felt different. It felt like fuel. She looked from her mother's cold eyes to Julian's arrogant smirk. They were so certain of their victory, so insulated by their own entitlement that they couldn't see the cliff they were walking toward. "I'll go inside," Elena said softly. She turned back to Julian, her gaze locking onto his. "But I'd keep those engines running if I were you. It's a lot of work to move all this equipment twice." She walked away before he could respond, leaving the scent of diesel and the sound of his rising, indignant voice behind her. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. She had the truth tucked against her heart, and the countdown was nearing its end. Inside the quiet foyer, she checked her watch. 24 hours until the groundbreaking ceremony. 24 hours until the cameras arrived to witness Julian's greatest triumph. She pulled the document from her pocket, the ink dark and indisputable. He had spent his life treating her like a guest in her own home. Tomorrow, she would remind him who actually held the keys. By 7 o'clock on Sunday evening, the air in the Vance dining room had curdled into something thick and indigestible. The heavy scent of roasted rosemary and expensive Cabernet filled the space, but it did nothing to mask the clinical coldness radiating from the head of the table. Elena sat in her usual place, her back straight, her fingers lightly tracing the condensation on her water glass. Across from her, the silver clinked against fine bone china, a rhythmic, sharp sound that felt like a countdown. Julian was in rare form. He leaned back in his chair, his tailored silk shirt straining slightly as he gestured with a wine glass. The gold of his watch caught the light of the chandelier, flashing with every arrogant movement. He had been talking for 20 minutes about the Vance Legacy Center, the massive development project he was set to break ground on the following morning. To him, the land was just a series of zeros on a balance sheet. To her, it was the ground that had held their family together for 4 generations. "The press is already confirmed," he said, his voice dripping with a self-satisfaction that made Elena's skin crawl. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He looked at the space just above her head, as if she were a piece of furniture he was considering replacing. "The governor's office sent a representative. This isn't just a building, Mother. It's a coronation." Lillian smiled, a thin, fragile expression that never reached her eyes. She reached out and patted his hand, her rings clicking against his cufflink. "You've worked so hard for this, Julian. It's only right that the family name is finally associated with something substantial. Something more than just old trees and crumbling greenhouses." Elena felt the first sharp spike of heat in her chest. It wasn't her heart failing this time. It was a pure, white-hot flash of indignation. "Those old trees were planted by our great-grandfather," she said, her voice low and steady. "The greenhouses are where this family's wealth actually started. It's heritage, not a burden." Julian finally deigned to look at her, his eyes narrowing with a patronizing pity that was far worse than his anger. "Heritage doesn't pay for your medical bills, Elena. Or did you forget who covered the costs of your little episode last month? Dr. Thorne is a talented man, but he isn't cheap. You should be thanking me for turning that stagnant dirt into liquid capital." The silence that followed was punctuated only by the sound of Julian sipping his wine. He was gaslighting her in front of their mother, rewriting her survival as a debt she owed him. He wanted her to feel small, a sickly dependent who should be grateful for his greed. "I'm quite aware of what things cost, Julian," she replied, her hand moving to the manila folder resting on the empty chair beside her, hidden by the tablecloth. She felt the crisp edge of the paper, the legal weight of the truth. "I'm also aware of what happens when you build on a foundation of lies." He let out a short, bark-like laugh. "Lies, don't be dramatic, it's business. In fact," he paused, leaning forward until the scent of his cologne, something musky and overpriced, became stifling. "I've decided to expand the Phase 1 parking lot. The Heritage Garden is coming down on Wednesday. I've already signed the demolition permits." The air seemed to leave the room. That garden was Elena's sanctuary, the place where she had spent her recovery relearning how to breathe. It was the heart of the estate. "You can't do that," she said, her voice barely a whisper, though it wasn't from weakness. It was the sound of a predator watching a trap snap shut. "I can and I have," he snapped, his facade of brotherly concern finally dropping to reveal the snarling entitlement beneath. "I am the executor of the Vance interests. You are a guest in this house, Elena, a guest who has overstayed her welcome. After the ceremony tomorrow, I think it's time we discussed your permanent relocation. There are some lovely assisted living facilities in the valley, very quiet, very out of the way." Lillian didn't protest. She simply busied herself with her salad, her silence a ringing endorsement of her son's cruelty. She had always chosen the golden child, even when he was stripping the skin off his own sister. Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she felt a strange, icy calm wash over her. She thought of the document in the folder, the one Julian had never bothered to look for because he was too busy looking in the mirror. He was so certain of his power that he hadn't noticed the shadow of the cliff he was standing on. "Tomorrow is going to be a very big day for you, isn't it?" she asked, her tone shifting to something almost conversational. She picked up her fork and took a small, deliberate bite of the lamb. It tasted like ash, but she swallowed it anyway. Julian smirked, his ego bolstered by her apparent retreat. "The biggest. The cameras will be there at 10 sharp. I suggest you stay in your room. You wouldn't want to have another spell in front of the cameras and ruin the aesthetic." "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world," she said, meeting his gaze with a clarity that finally made him blink. "I think the public deserves to see exactly what the Vance name stands for. I think they deserve to see the real owner of the land step into the light." Julian's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face before his arrogance smoothed it over. "What are you talking about? I'm the owner. I'm the heir." Elena stood up, the movement slow and regal. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The countdown had reached its final seconds. Sleep well, Julian, truly. You should enjoy the feeling of being the man in charge for one more night. She picked up the folder and walked toward the door, her heels clicking a steady, funereal beat on the hardwood. She didn't look back at her mother, who was finally looking up with a worried frown, or at Julian, who was already reaching for the wine bottle to pour another celebratory glass. As she reached the foyer, she checked her watch. 12 hours. In 12 hours, the cameras would be rolling. The governor's representative would be waiting. And Julian Vance would finally learn that when you spend your life treating people like shadows, you eventually find yourself standing in the dark. She stepped into the cool night air of the hallway, the weight of the house behind her already feeling like a ghost. Tomorrow, she wouldn't be the guest. She would be the reckoning. The following afternoon, the grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel was a sea of black ties and shimmering silk. Elena Vance stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold marble railing. Below, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of camera flashes. She watched the crowd move like a school of well-dressed piranhas, all circling the man of the hour. Julian Vance stood at the center of the room, his chest puffed out beneath a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than the average worker's yearly salary. He was laughing, a loud, performative sound that didn't reach his eyes, as he clinked a crystal flute of vintage champagne against the glass of a prominent city councilman. He looked every bit the rising political star, the golden sun poised to announce the largest development project the city had seen in a decade. "He looks like he's already won," a low voice murmured beside her. Elena didn't turn to see Dr. Marcus Thorne. She could feel the steady, grounding presence of her cardiologist, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the room. He was dressed in a simple, elegant suit, his eyes fixed on the spectacle below with a look of quiet concern. "He thinks he has," she replied, her voice a calm, steady blade. "Arrogance is a heavy cloak, Marcus. It makes it very hard to see the tripwire." She adjusted the strap of her modest black dress, her only jewelry a simple silver watch. In her hand, she gripped a slim, leather-bound folder. It felt heavier than it looked. As they descended the stairs, the crowd parted. Lillian Vance appeared from the throng, her face a masterpiece of surgical precision and forced smiles. She caught Elena's arm, her grip surprisingly tight. "You're late," she hissed, her eyes darting to the cameras. "And you're dressed like a librarian. Try to stand in the back when Julian starts his speech. This is his moment, Elena. Don't ruin the optics with your gloom." "I wouldn't dream of it, Mother," she said, gently disengaging her arm. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight found the podium. Julian stepped up, the applause deafening. He waited for the silence to stretch, savoring the weight of 1,000 eyes. "Today," Julian began, his voice booming with practiced charisma, "we don't just break ground on a building. We break ground on a legacy. The Vance Plaza will be the crown jewel of this district, a testament to my family's commitment to progress." He gestured to the massive screen behind him, which displayed a digital rendering of a glass and steel monolith. "And I am proud to announce that the land, held in trust for years, has finally been cleared for full development under my sole direction." "Actually," Elena's voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the sudden silence like a gunshot. She walked toward the stage, her heels clicking a rhythmic, funereal beat on the polished floor. The governor's representative, seated in the front row, leaned forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. Julian's smirk faltered, but he didn't lose his composure. "Not yet. Elena, dear, we're in the middle of a presentation. If you're looking for the coat, check." "I'm looking for the truth, Julian," she said, reaching the foot of the stage. She opened the folder and pulled out a single, notarized document. She didn't hand it to him. She handed it to the city's chief building inspector, who was standing inches away. "You might want to check the updated land registry. The trust you mentioned. It was dissolved 48 hours ago. The land isn't yours to develop. It belongs to the Vance Foundation for Ecological Preservation." The room went deathly still. The only sound was the hum of the projector and the frantic scratching of a reporter's pen. Julian's face didn't just change, it disintegrated. The smug, practiced mask of a rising politician curdled into a sickly, grayish hue that made the sweat on his forehead glisten like oil under the stage lights. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he seemed unable to control. His eyes, once sharp with predatory arrogance, darted frantically toward the exit, the pupils blown wide with a primal, animalistic terror. The veins in his neck corded, pulsing visibly as he struggled to draw air, his skin turning a mottled, bruised purple around his jawline. He looked less like a man and more like a cornered beast realizing the cage had no door. Lillian clutched her pearls so hard the strings snapped, white spheres scattering across the marble floor like tiny, panicked teeth. The governor's representative took a sharp step back, his expression shifting from professional boredom to icy, calculated disgust. "You spent years telling me I was the shadow, Julian," Elena said, her voice echoing in the hollow silence of the ballroom. "But shadows only exist when someone else is holding the light. Today, I'm turning it off." She turned and walked toward the exit, her head held high. She didn't need to stay to watch the scrambling. The unraveling had already begun. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom had barely clicked shut behind her when the silence of the foyer was shattered. Elena moved with a deliberate, rhythmic grace, her heels striking the polished marble with a sound like a ticking clock. She could feel the cool, rain-scented air drifting in from the entrance, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the perfume and desperation she had left behind. "Elena, stop right there!" Julian's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the stillness. She didn't turn, but she heard the frantic, heavy footfalls of her brother as he rounded the corner, his breathing labored and wet. He caught up to her near the grand staircase, his hand reaching out to grab her shoulder. Before his fingers could make contact, a shadow moved from the periphery. Dr. Marcus Thorne stepped into the light, his presence as solid and unyielding as a mountain. He didn't say a word, but the sheer weight of his gaze made Julian recoil, his hand dropping as if he'd been burned. "You think you've won?" Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of rage and panic. He looked disheveled, his silk tie loosened and his forehead slick with a cold, greasy sweat. "You've always been a bitter, sick little girl, Elena. You're hallucinating, those records. They're forgeries. You're trying to destroy this family because you couldn't handle being the weak link." Elena finally turned to face him. She didn't feel the familiar spike of cortisol or the fluttering of a heart that had once been her prison. She felt nothing but a vast, icy clarity. "The bank doesn't agree with you, Julian," she said, her voice low and steady. "Neither does the forensic accountant I hired 3 months ago. You didn't just steal from the campaign. You stole from the trust our father set up for the local conservatory. You've been gambling with money that was never yours to touch." "I was investing it," he roared, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "For the future, for the Vance name. You were covering the interest on a third mortgage for a penthouse you couldn't afford," she corrected him, her eyes never leaving his. The foyer doors opened again, and a small group spilled out from the ballroom. The governor's representative led the way, his face a mask of professional ice. Behind him stood Sarah Jenkins, the quiet assistant Julian had spent years belittling. She was holding a tablet, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Mr. Vance," the representative said, his voice clipped and final. "I've just received a preliminary verification from the State Ethics Board. The digital signatures on the transfer documents match your personal encryption key. The endorsement is withdrawn, effective immediately. We will be issuing a statement within the hour." Julian's face underwent a horrific transformation, the carefully curated mask of the rising statesman dissolving into a puddle of raw, ugly desperation. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the broken capillaries around his nose stand out like jagged red lightning. His eyes bulged, darting with a frantic, animalistic rhythm that suggested he was looking for a window to jump through rather than a way to explain. The smooth, practiced curve of his jaw seemed to collapse, his chin trembling with a rhythmic, wet-clicking sound as he tried and failed to form a single coherent syllable. He looked less like a man and more like a building being demolished from the inside out. Lillian emerged from the shadows last, her movements stiff and robotic. She looked at the governor's representative, then at the tablet in Sarah's hand, and finally at her son. The wounded wolf seemed to have lost her teeth. She moved toward Elena, her hands clasped in a pleading gesture that felt entirely alien. "Elena, darling," Lillian whispered, the scent of her expensive Lily Zandash perfume cloying in the small space. "We can fix this. We can issue a retraction. Think of the family. Think of the legacy. You're a Vance. Be a daughter for once and help us navigate this misunderstanding." The audacity of the request was a physical weight in the room. Elena looked at the woman who had ignored her heart surgery to attend a gala, the woman who had spent decades polishing the gold plating on a hollow statue. "I am thinking of the family," Elena said, and for the first time a small, cold smile touched her lips. "That's why I've already contacted the board of the conservatory. I've personally guaranteed the missing funds from my own firm's accounts. The Vance name will survive, Mother, but the two of you won't be the ones carrying it." "You can't do this," Julian whimpered, his knees buckling. He slumped against the mahogany banister, the wood groaning under his weight. "I have nothing. Everything is tied up in the campaign. If you pull the funding now, I'm ruined." "You aren't ruined, Julian," Elena said, stepping toward the heavy brass handles of the front door. "You're finally honest. You're exactly what you've always been, a man with nothing but a stolen suit and a loud voice." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need to see the final collapse. She felt the cold brass of the door handle under her palm, a solid, real sensation that anchored her to the present. As she pushed the door open, the sound of the rain intensified, a rhythmic drumming that washed away the lingering heat of the ballroom. Marcus followed her out onto the portico, his coat draped over his arm. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew she was more than okay. She was free. "Where to now?" he asked softly. Elena looked out at the dark, wet driveway, where the headlights of her car were already cutting through the gloom. She thought of the garden she was designing, the one with the deep roots and the plants that thrived in the shade. She thought of the quiet house that didn't smell like lilies or lies. "Home," she said. "I have a lot of work to do tomorrow." Behind them, the foyer was silent, save for the sound of Julian's ragged, sobbing breaths and the sharp, clinical tapping of the governor's representative as he began the phone calls that would end a career. Elena didn't look back. She walked down the steps, her head held high, leaving the shadows to fight over the scraps of a name she no longer needed to protect. The engine turned over with a low, powerful hum, and as she pulled away, the grand estate of the Vance family grew smaller in the rearview mirror, until it was nothing more than a flickering light in a very dark woods. 6 months had passed since the iron gates of the Vance estate had swung shut behind her for the last time. Elena Vance stood in the center of her new studio, the space filled with the invigorating scent of fresh cedar shavings and the clean, sharp aroma of damp blueprint ink. Sunlight flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the intricate scale model of the city's new botanical conservatory resting on her work table. It was her design. It was her legacy, built not on the shaky foundation of a stolen inheritance, but on the steady rhythm of a heart that finally felt like it belonged to her. She checked her watch, a simple, elegant piece of brushed steel. She had a final walkthrough with the city planners in an hour, but there was one stop she needed to make first. It wasn't a journey born of spite, but a necessary ritual of closure. The neighborhood she drove to was a stark departure from the manicured lawns and silent corridors of her youth. Here, the air was thick with the smell of bus exhaust and old brick, and the soundtrack was the constant, rhythmic thrum of a city that never stopped to ask for permission. She pulled her car to the curb across from a weathered, third-floor walk-up, where the paint was curling away from the window frames like dead skin. A woman emerged from the heavy front door, clutching a plastic grocery bag with a white-knuckled grip, as if it were a designer clutch. Lillian Vance looked smaller than she had half a year ago. The sharp, predatory elegance had been replaced by a frayed wool coat that didn't quite fit her shoulders. She paused at the edge of the sidewalk, her chin snapping up in that familiar, regal arc as a delivery cyclist zoomed past, nearly clipping her toes. For a second, the old fire flickered. She began to point a trembling finger, her lips moving in what was surely a lecture on who she was and the respect she was owed. But the cyclist didn't even look back, disappearing into the traffic with a casual shout of indifference. Lillian stood there, frozen, the realization hitting her again, as it likely did every hour of every day, that her name was no longer a shield. It was just a word. Julian Vance followed her out a moment later, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. The tailored blazers and silk ties were gone, replaced by a generic blue windbreaker with a local courier service logo stitched onto the breast. He looked tired, the arrogance that had once fueled his every breath hollowed out by the reality of a 40-hour work week and a bank account that didn't refill itself by magic. He muttered something sharp to his mother, a flash of the old venom, but she didn't even turn. They were trapped in a new kind of prison, one made of 4 cramped walls and the deafening silence of a social circle that had deleted their numbers the moment the first subpoena was served. Elena watched them from behind the glass of her car, her hands steady on the steering wheel. She didn't feel the surge of triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a profound, quiet peace. The face slap hadn't been a single moment of public ruin. It was this, the slow, grinding weight of being ordinary in a world they had spent their lives looking down upon. However, as she watched them bicker over the contents of the grocery bag, a sharp, cold pang of grief hit her. This was the cost of her justice. She had traded the comfortable illusion of a family for the harsh reality of her own independence. She was an orphan now, not by tragedy, but by necessity. She thought of the family portraits that had once lined the grand hallway, all those lies painted in oil, and realized they were likely sitting in a dusty warehouse now, waiting for an auction that would never come. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, the vibration humming against the plastic. It was a message from Marcus. "Sight looks incredible in the morning light. I've got the coffee. See you in 10. She smiled, the tension in her jaw finally dissolving. Dr. Marcus Thorne had been the one to remind her that a heart was more than just a medical marvel. It was the place where she kept her courage. Elena put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the two figures grew smaller and smaller, blending into the gray, indifferent backdrop of the city until they were indistinguishable from the shadows of the buildings. She reached the conservatory site 10 minutes early. Standing on the edge of the excavated earth, she looked at the deep trenches where the foundations were being poured. The roots would be deep here. The glass would be strong. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of rain and possibility, and stepped forward into the life she had finally earned.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.